So do you all ever lament over anything? When we lament, we give voice to our grief and mourning. And to give voice to grief and mourning is a really important step in healing the grief that we all are going to face at some point or another in our lives. Grief is an inevitable part of life. And so the psalmists and the prophets all understood the power of lament. They knew the healing power of it. And both of our Old Testament readings today are laments. If you look in your bulletin at Psalm 54, you can see how a lament is shaped. The first thing the lamenting psalmist does is to call on God. The psalmist says, "Save me, O God, by your name. In your might, defend my cause. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth." That is, listen, God, listen to me. And then in the next verse comes the complaint, or the description of the suffering. And for the psalmist, that's where the arrogant have risen up against me, and the ruthless have sought my life. Those who have no regard for God. That's the complaint of the psalmist, and that's why the psalmist is calling on God. And then, as in every lament, the psalmist confidently calls on God for help. "Behold, God, you're my helper. You're the one who sustains my life." And then the psalmist, and this is one thing I love about laments because we all feel this way, the psalmist asks for a condemnation of the enemy. And this one is mild compared to some of the lament psalms in the Bible. But this psalmist just says, "Render evil to those who spy on me. In your faithfulness, destroy them." And then often there's a confession of sin, not explicitly stated in this psalm, but then we get the response of the psalmist who is faithfully calling on God, because the psalmist always in a lament psalm, or any lament in the Bible, trusts that God is going to respond. And in this psalm, the psalmist says, "I will offer you," this is the psalmist's response, "I will offer you a free will sacrifice and praise your name, O Lord, for it is good. For you have rescued me from every trouble, and my eye has seen the ruin of my foes." So in the lament psalm, the psalmist always ends up knowing that God is going to take care of whatever the lament is about. Now, not only do the psalmists lament in this powerful way, but so does the earth itself. And we all know that the earth has so many things to lament about these days. Climate change, oil spills, gigantic fires, and now topsoil starting to blow again from the dust belt. And closer to home, we've got lawns that strip the landscape of plants that sustain the local ecosystem, putting pollinators at risk. And lawnmowers put out more pollution than our cars do. And the list goes on. Yes, the earth has reason to lament. But the earth cries out to its creator as the lament psalm. "Behold, God is my helper. It is the Lord who sustains my life." And we all know that the earth waits and trusts its creator, the Lord. But in its waiting, the earth is not passive. In fact, in line with today's psalm, the earth offers up its free will sacrifices, those natural processes that God has put in place to rescue the earth from trouble. And here's a local example of lament and offering on the part of the earth that we've probably all seen because we all drive up and down Route 17. You know that place on Route 17 where they're doing the road work on the culvert that collapsed in that big field? We all watch the loggers from the state cut down all those trees and just leave a big mess. And I would say the earth in that area has been in lament. At least it looks that way. The trees, all the creatures they sheltered are gone, and it's just a mess. But now, the earth is offering up a highly visible free will sacrifice of praise to God, one that will help the area recover and will also help us. Because the earth is very generous in this respect, helping us even as we've harmed it. As you drive through that area, especially this last week, you might have seen all those little white things just floating around on the road. That's because that whole area is covered with thousands of American burnweed plants that have been covered in their fluffy blooms. And here's one that's very messy. Have you seen these growing? Well, that field is full of them, thousands of them. Now, if you read the September Parish Post, this is a test. You can tell me why a field of American burnweed is a wonderful thing. Who knows? I told Ben you couldn't answer this. No, you can't answer. Who knows? Who read the Parish Post? Who read about American burnweed? Okay, I'm going to assume you read it, but you forgot. Okay. So American burnweed takes nitrogen dioxide out of the air. And that's one of the chemicals that are being spewed across that field from our cars as they pass on Route 17. That's one of the things that come out of our cars, nitrogen dioxide. Of all of the plants tested so far, American burnweed is one of the most efficient of all plants at absorbing nitrogen dioxide. In fact, and that chemical causes, it makes it hard for us to breathe. It's a component of acid rain. But American burnweed is so efficient at absorbing nitrogen dioxide that Japanese scientists are thinking that it would be really good to build green walls of American burnweed and other plants that are good at absorbing nitrogen dioxide along roadways and near buildings to remove that chemical from the air, a natural way to remove nitrogen dioxide. Now on Route 17, the earth has just created that green wall on its own, and the burnweed is absorbing nitrogen dioxide every time we drive past. And the weeds are helping to anchor the soil so all that soil doesn't wash away into the watershed. Although that area is going to take decades to recover, the healing has already begun. So as I drive by, just imagine the earth saying, I will offer you a free will sacrifice of this weed, O Lord, and praise your name because it is good. And knowing what this earth's free will offering of weeds in that life area are doing, we too can offer thanks and praise to the Lord for nature's healing power and praise the Lord's name as we drive through this area. Now, the lamenting psalmist's knowledge that God will respond and has confidence in God is evident in today's gospel as well. Because Jesus knew the lament psalms. As we said in Bible study on Wednesday, when Jesus is on the cross and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the beginning of Lament Psalm 22. So we know that Jesus knew that psalm and many others too, and would have known the end of it, even as he's feeling betrayed. But in today's gospel, Jesus tells the disciples for the second time that he's going to be betrayed, killed, and then 3 days later, he will rise again. Now, the first time Jesus tells the disciples this, and we heard that a few Sundays ago, Peter gets really upset and rebukes Jesus and says, no way, Lord. And Jesus has to say, get behind me, Satan. So the second time around, the disciples don't say a word, they don't ask, they don't understand, they're afraid to ask, because helps them avoid facing their fear and their sorrow. So Jesus sits down and teaches them. He gives them a better way to deal with their fear than with anger and with arguments. Jesus tells them that whoever wants to be first must be last and be the servant of all. And then to illustrate his point, he takes a little child and holds that child in his arms and says to the disciples, "Whoever welcomes such a child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me but the one who sent me." It's important to remember that children were non-people in biblical times. They had zero standing. And for Jesus to hold a child and say that to welcome an insignificant child in his name is to welcome the one who sent him would have been mind-blowing to the disciples, who had just been arguing about who was the greatest among them. Jesus reminds the disciples of the power of immense conclusion, the affirming of confidence and trust in God, knowing that even in the most insignificant and lowly things, like a child in biblical times or like a weed along the roadside, that God is present and working and bringing resurrection to the earth and bringing resurrection out of death every time. So, I encourage you today to lament over those things that grieve you, rather than to give into anger with one another or to give into anger about whatever it is, as the disciples did when they were arguing about who should be the greatest, trying to just have some control. If the disciples had lamented, they would have been acknowledging the awful things that were going to happen. And they, like Jesus, would have then put their worries into God's hands, trusting that God would bring order out of the chaos, that God would right the wrong, that God would bring justice where there is none. And as today's lamenting psalmist reminds us, to lament is not to be passive in the face of tragedy. Lament is not about sitting alone in the room and saying, "Oh God, I'm calling on you, things are awful, please strike my enemies dead, and I praise your name." It's not that. That's part of it. But to lament is to be active. When we lament, we do all of the things I just said. We ask for help, we express confidence in trust in God as we offer our praise and thanksgiving to God, and then we act. And so we come together here at St. Peter's not to argue and to be angry with one another, but part of what we do is to lament. And as a result of our lament is to offer a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving as we open our eyes and trust in God. And that means we reach out our hands to the people who may seem insignificant to the powerful on this earth. We see the hungry. We lament hunger. And we offer our sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving through our food distribution. We see the poor around the world, and so we lament poverty. And trusting in God, we offer a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, most recently through our mission to school children in Jamaica. We see those in our country who have been treated unjustly, and so we lament racial injustice. And trusting in God, we offer a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving in the continuing work of our Sacred Ground group, and in the acknowledgement that long before we arrived, the Native Americans cared and tended the land on which we now gather to worship. So in this season of creation, I encourage you to look around and to lament, especially and thanksgiving by welcoming God in the most insignificant of things, as Jesus told the disciples to welcome a little child. Welcome God in the burnweed, absorbing nitrogen dioxide, and in the devil's walking stick plants, now putting out their sustaining berries for wildlife. Welcome God in the goldenrod, and the wheat stem, and the asters, and the autumn plots that provide nectar and pollen for the insects that pollinate the plants that feed us and sustain us. For God is at work all around us, redeeming and renewing and healing the earth, and healing us too. Trusting in God, we can welcome the seemingly insignificant gifts of God's creation as an act of praise, giving them their rightful place as a way of saying thank you, both to God and to the earth itself, for all that God provides for us in God's good creation.